Somewhere in the midst of all this came the miracle, and my fate was sealed. For a while now, I had already been nursing the dream of becoming a nun, a la Audrey Hepburn as Sister Luke in The Nun's Story. She made convent life quasi-erotic. Several times we see her in a state of déshabillé, when the lunatic patient, nicknamed the Archangel, attacks and presumably tries to rape her. And again, when she is in the Congo being diagnosed with TB by a rather saucy Peter Finch playing Dr. Fortunati. I aspired to such a combination of discipline and disobedience as she seemed to embody. Being Lutheran rather than Catholic never struck me as any kind of problem. The only real problem, as I saw it, seemed to me my looks. Unlike the semi-emaciated Hepburn, I was from sturdily built Scandinavian stock. Nevertheless, I kept hope alive and imagined ways I might transform myself into a placid, dewy-eyed, drop-dead gorgeous, chaste yet sexually realized Catholic sister who spoke in dulcet tones, charmed Dr. Fortunati, and still managed to walk away from the convent young enough to bear offspring similarly genetically endowed. Jesus had said, "With God all things are possible." Who was I to argue? Becoming a nun appealed to me. From what I had observed from my friends who went to Catholic schools, the nuns seemed to me to live very uncluttered lives, lives free of emotional messiness, as if such a thing could be hacked off in the same way their hair was hacked off before they took the veil. I was all for losing the emotional messes in my life. I wasn't crazy about the idea of losing my hair. I didn't much like the poverty, chastity, obedience trinity either. I wanted love, love, love. If I was going to be obedient, I wanted to be obedient to a firm but gentle husband. I wanted marriage. I suspected I wanted sex too, and poverty had absolutely no appeal. Still, Sister Luke made convent life look pretty decent. And in fact, if there had been any chance that convent life could somehow shape my eyebrows and cultivate my speech so that I looked like, or even just sounded like Audrey Hepburn, God could have gotten the whole ball of wax: chastity, obedience, even poverty. He could have had my red fuck me Barbie shoe and my confession about the 5 lousy butter cookies. Anything, so long as I got to be just like Audrey Hepburn as Sister Luke. But I was no fool, and I knew that wasn't going to happen. And in a way, I guess it was a relief. If I wasn't going to look like Audrey Hepburn, I also didn't have to give it all up for God. That's what I thought, anyway. And then I saw the miracle. After my father died, my mother became more of an insomniac than ever before. Every night she dozed on the couch for a few hours, then woke up to climb into bed around 3 a.m. She seemed frail on the couch, with thin skin starting to wrinkle from years of sunshine and heavy smoking. She was subject to fits of coughing and was diagnosed with diverticulosis. She needed watching. So I became a night owl, crawling out of bed to prowl the house, making sure we were all present and accounted for. I would watch late night TV lying on the floor, chin in hands. But I wasn't only watching TV. I was also guarding my mother's life. On commercial breaks, I would observe the continued rise and fall of her chest to make sure she was still alive. After the Star-Spangled Banner was finished and the color bar came on, I listened closely for the whispery sound of her breathing. I needed to make sure that she was still there with me, and the only way to do that was to be there with her. It was on my night watch that I saw the miracle. I'm curious. This is not the Fellini movie, but have any of you ever seen The Miracle? Raise your hand. You've seen it? With Carol Baker? Wow, I'm impressed. A schlocky film by any standards, The Miracle was filmed in early Technicolor with a haunting score by Elmer Bernstein and a story that couldn't have been more histrionic. Carol Baker was badly miscast as the beautiful young nun Teresa. A particularly effeminate Roger Moore fawns all over himself as Captain Michael Stewart. The film is set in a small convent tucked into a remote Spanish village during the War of 1812. It was probably a Pyrenean village because it sat in the middle of a big patch of bad soil and lousy weather. The valley's meager prosperity was wholly dependent on the statue of the Virgin Mary, whose presence loomed darkly from her own apse in the convent chapel. And it was into that very convent that a wounded English officer, Captain Michael Stewart, was carried from a battleground on which Spanish and English armies fought to stave off the invading French. Of all the sisters in the convent, only the beautiful young postulant, Teresa, can help him heal. We discover right away that Teresa doesn't seem cut out to be a nun, though she claims she wants to be one. We sense from the very first that just beneath her starched white wimple, Teresa is a woman of deep and seething passion. So to no one's surprise, Teresa and Michael fall in love. Michael wants her to marry him. Teresa, in the throes of a vocational crisis, goes into the chapel to beg the statue of the Virgin Mary for a sign. Should she remain in the convent, devoted to good works and the dark mysteries of Christ? Or should she go off with Michael to the sunny New Jerusalem of Britain to be his bride? Anyone might think that this was a question worthy of an answer, but no answer is forthcoming. All Teresa hears is the silence of the convent chapel. Silence. How could she serve a God whose will is absolutely shrouded in silence? Her will, her desire, has a shape and a name. And so she vows to leave the convent and marry Michael. She throws down her habit and runs half naked into town, just as any love-struck nun without a clothing allowance would do. But in town, she only finds chaos. The French have invaded, death is everywhere, people are fleeing, soldiers are killing, bandits are pillaging. And that's how Teresa discovers that Michael has been killed. She sees Michael's distinctive boots on what she assumes to be his dead body. Almost naked and entirely alone, Teresa stumbles aimlessly. What can she do? She is lost. She has no marketable skills, at least none that the viewer knows about yet. So when a wise old gypsy woman offers to help her, how can she refuse? The old gypsy woman brings Teresa to her camp. She feeds Teresa. She gives her a dress that is warmer than the scanty shift she'd fled the convent in, yet far more fetching than her chaste white postulant's habit. The dress is black. It shows shoulder. It shows leg. What red-blooded gypsy male wouldn't fall in love with an ex-nun in an eye-popping, breast-sculpting little black dress who, it turns out, can also sing and dance like, well, a gypsy? Not just one, but two gypsy males do. They are brothers. One of them is the good brother, and the other one is as bad as they come. Teresa chooses the good brother, and they make plans for a wedding. But as the couple dances at the wedding reception, the standard Hollywood gypsy version of foreplay, the bad brother sneaks up and drives a knife into the back of the good brother, killing him instantly. And now, Teresa, twice a widow yet never a bride, is shattered. Mad with grief, she flees the gypsy camp. Where will she go? Now, this is where it gets confusing. We have to wait to find out where she goes because meanwhile, a backstory is going on. We discover that Captain Michael Stewart has not been killed at all. A thief had stolen his boots, and it was that very thief whom Teresa had seen lying dead, not Michael at all. He had escaped. And now we see him returning to the valley where the convent is, stopping in at the convent for the Mass, at which Teresa will profess her vow. But how can that be? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to the viewer, but we watch him watching Teresa as she makes her slow way down the aisle in the convent church. She is dressed like a a bride of Christ. She is so lovely. And there is nothing hesitant, nothing hurried or uncertain about the way she prostrates herself before the priest, before Christ, before those who have assembled to watch her transformation from woman to nun. Her lover is convinced this calm and beautiful being has a religious calling. She was never meant to be his wife. The only home she will know is the convent where she will live with all the other brides of Christ. But the convent has fallen on hard times, as has the entire village. A vice grip of doubt chokes the valley. Nothing will grow, and little wonder. Several planting seasons ago, the statue of the Virgin Mary in the convent chapel disappeared. Someone stole her. The inhabitants of the valley believe that the drought is their punishment. They are all being made to suffer for the sin of the one who stole her. At this point, the story shifts back to Teresa. She has long since fed the gypsy camp. She has long since stopped suffering over her lover's murder. She has drowned her grief in concupiscence and fame. What a heady cocktail. An impresario has discovered that this former nun and erstwhile gypsy has a great flair for the stage. He calls her Miraflores, the gypsy. Soon she is dancing and singing in theaters all over Europe. Her life as a nun is behind her now. She travels, drinks champagne, and enchants a matador, an aging aristocrat, and her public. Then one day, Captain Michael Stewart goes to see Miraflores, the gypsy, and discovers that she is none other than his Teresa. And yet, how can that be? How can this woman be the lovely novice he saw professing her vows to Christ? He meets with her backstage. And as they talk, it's clear that the love they share has never diminished. And it is not too late, Michael assures her. They can still marry. They can still find bliss in each other's arms. He tells her of his journey to find her, how he went to the convent to seek her there. And then he tells her of the drought, of the suffering in the valley of the convent. He tells her that the statue of the Blessed Mother has been stolen, and the people live in fear of God's unyielding wrath. And as he tells her all this, something stirs within her. She sees now. She understands. It is the will of God. All those she loves, Michael, her gypsy lover, the people of the valley, her sisters in the convent, all of them are doomed to suffer as long as Teresa continues to ignore what God has called her to do. Go back to the convent and give her entire life to God. There is no compromise. There is no middle way. Teresa must leave Michael for his own safety. She must leave her singing career and worldly pleasures. She must return. She must don the habit and bow to the will of the one who will never leave her alone, the one from whom there is no escape. And so once again she flees. But this time she flees to the drought-stricken valley and to the convent, weeping and penitent. The wind tears at her skirts. The branches scratch her face. Lightning splits the technicolor sky. She races into the convent chapel and throws herself on the stone-cold floor. Guilty, tormented by her sins, she begs for forgiveness. And as she lies there praying and weeping, the viewer sees what Teresa will never see: the shadow of a tall, graceful woman moving across the chapel floor. The shadow falls across Teresa's prone figure and then enters into the apse of the Blessed Mother, the booth that has stood empty for 4 years. The Blessed Mother, the sublimely blissful nun Michael had seen professing her vows, remains no longer the living, breathing substitute for Sister Teresa, but a statue once again. The real Teresa has returned. She has learned her lesson. She had never, ever really been free. Only Teresa and the viewer will ever know of the miracle of the statue. Only Teresa and the viewer will fully comprehend that it had always been a matter of time until Teresa would feel the irresistible force of God's will. It was only a matter of time until, Worn down by sin, she would return in full and beautiful submission to him. And I meant to say this at the beginning. I don't refer to God by male pronouns, but at this point in my life I did. It was then, as the Bernstein score crescendoed to its close and Teresa lay pristine and obedient on the floor, that I knew I was done for. At 12 years old, I knew God had me in his sights. Just like Teresa, my life could never, ever really be my own. End of sorry story. God had me, and God was always here. God was always there. God saw everything, knew everything. He knew my sinful thoughts, my terror of him, my vanity. God knew what I feared and what I loved, and God knew how to hurt me. And more I believed that if hurting me was what it took to make me give my life to God, he wouldn't hesitate. I knew those words of St. Paul's in Romans too well. Oh, I just caught a big typo. I knew those words of St. Paul's from 1 Corinthians too well. For I am convinced that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus, our Savior. I used to think those words had been meant to console us, to assure us that we were never alone. But now I understood the God I feared was with me all of the time, and I would never, ever be able to get away.